we're going to learn how to make dough and bake bread using our King Arthur flour baking kits. Let's get started. Inside each kit, you'll find a recipe booklet which includes the step-by-step instructions to the recipes we'll be making in this video, a sack of all-purpose flour, white whole wheat flour, a dough scraper, and active dry yeast. We'll need some other equipment too, so grab a large mixing bowl, 2 medium-sized bowls, a liquid measuring cup, a 1 cup dry and 1/4 cup measuring cup, a measuring spoon, and a spoon for mixing. A ruler is optional as well. Now that we have our supplies, let's go over the ingredients needed to make our basic dough recipe. We're going to use both all-purpose flour, white whole wheat flour, warm water, sugar, packet of yeast, salt, and some vegetable oil. Let's start by prepping our flour. Using 2 medium-sized bowls, pour each bag of flour into separate bowls, then fluff the flour with a fork. Fluffing the flour will help us achieve a lighter, fluffier, and more uniform dough. After you've prepared your flour, set it aside and grab the large mixing bowl. Add 2 cups of warm water and a 1/4 cup of sugar into the warm water. Mix the sugar and water together until it dissolves. Next, we're going to add our packet of active dry yeast and mix it into the water until it dissolves as well. What exactly is yeast? Yeast is a single-cell organism that belongs in the fungi kingdom, just like mushrooms. This means yeast is a living organism that leads a simple life. It only needs a few things to survive: water, food, and warmth. Just like in the name, our active dry yeast is currently packaged in a dry state, which makes our yeast dormant, or essentially asleep. In order for our yeast to become alive, we have to mix it with some warm water to wake it up. Once the yeast is awake, it's going to be hungry. This is where the sugar comes into play. The yeast will begin to eat the sugar. Now that we've provided the right conditions for our yeast to wake up, it's time for it to get to work. While the yeast is eating the sugar in our mixture, the next thing we're going to do is add flour. We'll begin with 2 cups of the white whole wheat flour. After you mix in the first 2 cups, let it rest for a few minutes and watch what happens. You should start to see bubbles appearing in your dough. That is from the result of our yeast eating the sugar and the dough and essentially burping out these bubbles, which are made of carbon dioxide. This is what's going to make our dough rise and get bigger. Now add 1 last cup of whole wheat flour for a total of 3 cups. Next, we'll add a 1/4 cup of vegetable oil and a tablespoon of salt. These ingredients will help our dough stick together. time for the last step of our dough making process, adding in the all-purpose flour. Just like the white whole wheat flour, add in 2 cups of all-purpose flour. Next, measure out 1 more cup of all-purpose flour and set it aside for a total of 3 cups. Mix the 2 cups of all-purpose flour into your dough with a measuring spoon. Do you notice the texture of your dough changing? Keep mixing until most of the flour is incorporated into the dough. For the last cup of all-purpose flour, we're only going to add about a half a cup into the mixing bowl. And switch from the mixing spoon to the dough scraper. Clean the flour from the sides of the bowl and press it into the dough until the dough is covered with flour and no longer sticky. Now it's time to knead the dough. Remove the dough from the mixing bowl and onto your work surface. When we knead our dough, we're helping to mix the ingredients and give our bread a good texture. The kneading process will warm and stretch the gluten in our dough, which will make the dough more springy and stretchy. So here are some tips for kneading dough. Use the flour from the remaining quarter cup you set aside to sprinkle on your work surface, hands, or dough as needed. This will prevent our dough from sticking onto things. Now we're going to start the kneading process by repeating 3 simple steps. First, fold the top edge of the dough in half towards you. Then push the dough down and away with the palm of your hand. Next, turn the dough 90 degrees or a quarter turn. So repeat, fold, push, turn. Fold, push, turn. Fold, push, turn. Fold, push, turn. Repeat this process for about 5 minutes. After kneading the dough for 5 minutes, let it rest for a bit and begin to prep your mixing bowl by scraping out any leftover pieces of dough and then smearing a little bit of oil. Return to your ball of dough and knead it for a few more minutes, then shape it into a round ball. You'll know when your dough is ready by giving it a little poke and making sure it bounces back. After all that wrestling, your dough is now ready to rest. Put it into the large mixing bowl and cover it with some plastic wrap and a clean towel so it doesn't dry out. Leave the dough somewhere nice and warm for it to rest for about an hour and a half. When we come back to our dough, it's going to double in size. That's because while it was resting, our yeast was still eating the sugar and releasing the carbon dioxide bubbles. These bubbles stayed trapped in the dough because of all the gluten we were able to help create when we were kneading the dough. This means we should have awesome, fluffy, and airy bread, my favorite kind. Now it's time to shape our dough and prepare it for baking. In our recipe booklet, there are so many great recipes to try. I'll demonstrate 3 different kinds using the same dough. The first one I'll attempt is the braided loaf. For this recipe, we'll need half of our dough, so go ahead and cut your dough in half by using the dough scraper. Set 1/2 aside for later. Now begin shaping your dough into a simple loaf shape. Next, make 3 indents and divide the dough into 3 equal portions. Use your dough scraper to cut the dough into 3 pieces. Okay, now we're going to roll each piece of dough into ropes of equal thickness and lengths. I do this by using both of my palms and rolling the dough down and out, again and again. Repeat this for the other 2 pieces of dough until they're all about the same size and length. If the dough bites you, then let it rest for a few minutes. This will give it time to relax and it'll be easier to mold. Now it's time to braid the dough. First, pinch the 3 pieces of dough together at the top. Then move 1 rope to the left and 2 to the right. We're going to braid this loaf by taking the outside rope from the pair and crossing it over to the middle. Repeat this again with every outside piece until you reach the bottom. Once you get to the end, pinch the ends and tuck it under. Now prepare a baking sheet by adding a bit of oil to the sheet, and then allow the dough to rest on the baking sheet for 30 minutes before baking. Cover the dough with the same piece of plastic wrap and towel from earlier. Now, using the remaining dough we had set aside, I'm going to cut it in half again. This piece of dough will be used for garlic knots, one of my favorite items to order at a pizzeria. We're going to make the garlic knots by cutting the dough into 8 equal pieces. You can do this by making a mark in the middle, then 2 more marks in the middle of each section, and then dividing the sections in half again until you have 8 pieces. Cut these pieces with your dough scraper. Now, roll each piece of dough out like how we did for our braided loaf. You can use a ruler for this part if you'd like to try and make sure that each piece of dough is about 8 inches long. Now, tie your rope of dough into a loose knot by looping one end through the knot, and then repeat with the other side. Continue these steps with all the remaining pieces of dough. Once you have tied your 8 knots, go ahead and let it rest on the same baking sheet as your braided loaf and cover and let it rest for 30 minutes. With the last piece of dough, I'm going to make cinnamon rolls. But first, we have to make some cinnamon sugar. Combine 1 tablespoon of cinnamon to 4 tablespoons of sugar. Mix this together and then set aside. Now let's roll out the dough for our cinnamon rolls. To do this, you'll need the help of a rolling pin. If you don't have a rolling pin, you can use any cylinder-shaped bottle like a hydro flask or canteen. Roll the dough out until it's shaped like a rectangle, about 8 to 12 inches. You can use your ruler again to roughly measure the size of your dough. I think this looks good, so now I'm going to cover my dough with cinnamon sugar, leaving a 1-inch strip at the top edge exposed. Now let's roll the dough from the bottom up towards the bare strip of dough. Pull along at the edges to keep the piece of dough evenly stretched. Okay, now seal the seams together and measure out 8 equal pieces and cut again using the dough scraper. Once you have your 8 pieces, place the rolls on a baking sheet and let it rise for 30 minutes before we put it in the oven. Now is a good time to preheat your oven. After 30 minutes, our shaped dough should have risen a bit. Now it's time to bake. First, I'm going to transfer my cinnamon rolls. I'm using a cast iron skillet, but you can use any round baking dish. Just make sure to try and space the cinnamon rolls evenly in the dish. These are now going to be ready for the oven. We're going to bake these cinnamon rolls for 20 to 25 minutes in the oven, and then we're going to put a glaze over it. Now I'm going to transfer my knotted rolls onto its own baking sheet, since these bake at a lower temperature and shorter time than the loaf. These will go in the oven for about 12 to 15 minutes at 350 degrees. Our braided loaf will bake at 375 degrees for 30 minutes. While the knots are in the oven, I'm going to make a dressing for my garlic knots by using a few simple ingredients. Start by crushing a couple of cloves of garlic. After you crush and peel the garlic, go ahead and mince it into tiny pieces. Next, I add the minced garlic into a small saucepan. I'm also going to add oregano I harvested from the school garden, as well as some olive oil. Now heat up the mixture on the stove at a very low heat for about 5 minutes. Okay, our knots are out of the oven. Time to transfer it onto a cooling rack. Next, we're going to brush these knots with our oil mixture. Add a little bit of salt to your garlic-infused oil, and now brush each knot with the garlic and oregano oil we just made. Now our garlic knots are ready to be enjoyed. Next, I'm going to make a glaze for my cinnamon rolls, which is an optional addition. I'm making my glaze with some powdered sugar, butter, warm water, and vanilla extract. Let's start by adding a 1/4 cup of powdered sugar into a mixing bowl. Then I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of melted butter and about 4 tablespoons of warm water. And then just a splash of vanilla extract. Mix these ingredients together until we start to form a glaze. Now let's grab our cinnamon rolls from the oven. The cinnamon rolls look great as is, but I'm going to go ahead and add the glaze by spooning it over the warm rolls. Add as much or as little as you'd like. I probably won't use all of this glaze, but I'm going to use enough to cover every nook and cranny. I can't wait to try one. And last but not least, here's our braided loaf out of the oven. Ta-da! We just made 3 different bread products using the same dough recipe. Which recipes will you make with your dough? Be sure to take a picture of your wonderful creations and share with us. Thanks everyone for joining along.